Can you hear me?
Hey everyone, I know it's 9:30, but I'm just going to go ahead and give it one more minute for a few more people to trickle in. Okay, everyone, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Bakaja Caldwell, and I'm an attorney advisor here at ACUS. I'm also a staff counsel for the project Consultation with State, Local, and Tribal Governments and Regulatory Policymaking. Today, we at the Committee on Rulemaking are here to consider a recommendation arising out of this project. But before we do so, our Deputy Research Director, Kaja Novatsky, would like to say a few brief words.
Thanks, Bakaja. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kaja Novatsky. I'm the Deputy Research Director at ACUS. I'm also somewhat filling in for Jeremy Grayboys, who I see is also on this call. So he's been out on interim medical leave. So just if you have any further questions on the project or anything else, feel free to reach out to me. ACUS is continuing business as usual, and we have, 3 great recommendations that we're going to be considering at June's plenary session. In addition to this one, we have public participation in agency adjudication and agency investigative procedures. So we have a great slate of projects, and I look forward to hearing the committee discuss this recommendation. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, Kaja. So now what I'll do is I will call two roles. So the first role will be the names of committee members and alternates of committee members. After each name is called, the person should say here so we can make sure that their mics are working. So first, Bertrell Ross.
I am here.
Amy Brown.
I'm here.
Andrew Emery.
Here.
Bill Funk.
Here.
Alex Goodenough.
Here.
Elena Ness.
Here.
Mitchell Plays. Mitchell. Okay, move on. David Pritzker.
I'm here.
Thank you, David. Lon Smith
Here.
and Jessica Stone. So is there any committee member present whose name I did not call? Hearing none. So the second role will be the names of ACUS members who were not on the committee and their alternates. After each name is called, the person should say here, so we can make sure that their mics are working. I will not call the names of members of the public who do not have speaking privileges, meaning you should write in the chat if you would like to speak. So first up is Nick Goldstein.
Here.
Carrie Rogers, designated alternate for Daniel Cohen.
Here, good morning.
Good morning, Carrie. Jeff Lubbers
Here.
and Noelle Green, designated alternate for Helen Serafio. Okay. Great. Is there any ACUS member present whose name I did not call? Okay, hearing none. Please reach out via the chat or via email if you experience any difficulties or technical difficulties during the meeting. ACUS staff will be happy to assist you with troubleshooting or moving to alternate means of participating. So now what I'll do is I'll go ahead and turn it over to Bertrell.
Thank you, Kaja. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. So I'll start by explaining the ground rules for discussion. Please note that only ACUS members, including government members and their designated alternates, public members, senior fellows, liaison representatives, and special counsels, whether or not on the committee and their designated alternates have full speaking privileges, meaning a non-ACUS member should write in the chat if you would like to speak. To avoid background noise, I ask that you keep your microphone on mute and either use Zoom's hand raise feature or add a comment in the chat feature if you'd like to speak. I'll then call on you and you can unmute yourself. Please then remute yourself when you're done. I also ask that ACUS members and their designated alternates use the webcam. With respect to attendees other than ACUS members and alternates, participation requires unanimous consent of the committee members. Time permitting, I'll consider calling on such attendees at appropriate points, and we will presume that committee members consent absent their raising an objection. If any such participant would like to speak, please so indicate in the chat feature or by using Zoom's hand raise feature and wait to speak until I call on you. You can then unmute yourself and please remute yourself when you are done speaking. For all participants, please use the chat function only to indicate that you'd like to speak or for committee members and their alternates to vote when asked. Please do not hold any sidebar discussions or put substantive comments in the chat feature. Only members of the Rulemaking Committee, including government members and their designated alternates, public members, senior fellows, liaison representatives, and special counsels have a vote. Please do not vote unless you're a member of the committee. We have a list of committee members in case you're unsure. Okay, so with that said, we are here to discuss a recommendation on consultation with state, local, and tribal governments and regulatory policymaking. We had two consultants that were working with us on this that produced a report that is a basis for this recommendation. They are here, I think, Seth Davis and Dan Rodriguez. And I will turn it over to them to present summary accounts of their report, and then we will begin our discussion of the recommendations. Seth or Dan, whoever wants to take this first.
Great. I'll go first. Let me just check to see if everybody can hear me. I might take the headphones in and then take them off, and I'll check again that. So we're going in not alphabetical order. And the reason for that, let me say at the outset is, well, before I get into the report, let me first take the opportunity to thank all of you, Bertrell and folks in ACUS and members of the committee for giving us an opportunity to to exchange some views and participate in this. I also want to, as I describe a bit, and Seth, of course, will add to this about the study, make a very special thanks to Bikaja Caldwell, without whom this report, like so many other reports, I suspect, would not have gotten to this point. So I want to thank Bikaja and others, including some folks I'm sure we don't know and haven't yet met, who've been absolutely instrumental in helping organize the research and develop interviews and do all the work, more than back office work, actually participatory work to get to this point. This is a report and a set of recommendations, as you know, that deals with consultation with state, local, and tribal governments. And given our expertise and our focus, we've really divided it up, as you'll see, with me taking the lion's share of the work. I mean, we've been full participants in the entire report and recommendations, but I've undertaken the lion's share of the work on the part dealing with state and local consultation, which is why I'm speaking first, and Seth on tribal consultation, and he will certainly add that, just so you know, and we'll, if as questions come up, you'll see that by way of context. Let me, if I may, take a few minutes to set the table with respect to the comments about the report, but I'm going to make it short because certainly my understanding and expectation is that you've read the report and the recommendations. So let me begin by saying, just by way of a summary of our study, Seth and I fully collaborated and worked together on the methodology and the focus of the study at the beginning throughout our research. And you will see as you've gone through the recommendations that while some of the recommendations deal separately with state and local consultation on the one hand and tribal consultation on the other, some of the other recommendations raise common concerns and are applicable to consultation across those levels of government. Let me say just a couple words about the scope and limits of our research, again, building on some of what's said in the report. We certainly did our best to reach out to the principal federal regulatory agencies, since probably goes without saying, basically all agencies in the federal government have some elements of their policymaking that implicate state and local interests and tribal interests as well. And many, if not most, well, let me just add, and many, if not most, deal with tribal matters as well, as Seth will discuss more in his comments. It won't surprise you that we didn't reach all of them through our request for formal interviews. A fact that, as we note in the report, not an excuse, but just a fact on the ground, that the bulk of our research happened during the November, December, and January timeframe. So one consequence was that it came during the holidays. Another consequence is it came during the time of the presidential administration. And so that proved somewhat challenging. However, we did, through a request for information, give agency officials and also the Office of Management and Budget the opportunity to share their comments on this subject. And we were able to collect a good number of comments through that process. Moreover, and I'm here speaking principally of the aspects of the study that deal with state and local consultation, we were able to connect with most of the associations that are part of what is often called, and many of you have heard this expression, I'm sure, the Big Seven. That is, organizations whose remit and responsibility is to represent state and local governments in, among other matters, administrative agency decision-making. And so with the agencies, we gave, and in addition to consultation and interviews with representatives of the Big Seven groups, we gave local governments an opportunity and state governments an opportunity to provide information as part of the RFI process, request for information, and they did provide comments, and also as part of an open comment session, sort of town hall meeting. Looking at the matter, and that's happy to answer any questions, of course, about the scope of the report and the study. But let me turn to the analysis of the conclusions, again, just briefly. Looking at the matter of state and local consultation from a big picture perspective, we were very interested and anxious to learn about how agencies, in fact, engage in the dialogue with state and local stakeholders, especially where, as is quite common, federal regulatory and administrative policies might affect individuals who have a stake in, and also state and local governments as such, and sometimes the government entities themselves. The idea that federal regulatory decision-making ought to take account of state and local interests is not a new one, and it doesn't originate certainly with our conclusions and analysis in this report. One sees in some of the earliest literature on the administrative state fruitful discussion of how successful implementation of federal policy requires engagement with other subnational levels and layers of government. And indeed, we can see this goal and do see this goal as tied to what we call the general values of federalism, as we describe in detail in our report. More recently, which is to say roughly in the last half century, the federal government has made this goal of federal, state, and local consultation more concrete, both in the delineation of consultation in important regulatory statutes, including, for example, the Clean Air and Water Acts, the Endangered Species Act, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, the Affordable Care Act, and also the Unfunded Mandates Act, whose title explicitly references the concerns with federal policy that risk not accounting adequately for regulatory burdens on state and local governments. A quarter century ago, President Clinton issued Executive Order 13132, entitled simply Federalism. This order explicitly calls for attention to federalism issues in the rulemaking process, such as regulatory preemption, and also taking into account of the interests and the views of state and local governments in the regulatory process. Especially pertinent to the subject of our study here, it calls explicitly for consultation with state and local governments before agency policies take effect. This executive order and a number of orders enacted since 1999, many, not all, but many still in effect, emphasize the need for federal agency engagement with state and local governments, and also due accounting for state and local interests and preferences in making and implementing policy. And so to sort of sum up federal policy in this space, we have long had an important tradition of requirements of state and local consultation as a key objective, and this has been manifest in explicit congressional and White House policy. The conclusions of our study, again, referring here to state and local consultation specifically, is that this expectation of robust, meaningful consultation among federal, state, and local decision makers is uneven at best and can be viewed candidly as insufficiently diligent and efficacious. Although Executive Order 13132 has within it the expectation and mandate that agencies will develop procedures that guide consultation, guidance that will presumably instruct agency officials about how, when, and even whether to consult with state and local governments on regulatory matters, we could not identify from our research many instances in which agencies had in fact developed and made publicly available these consultation procedures. This does not mean necessarily that consultation never happened, and that is not the conclusion of our report. But it does appear to happen when it does, episodically and sometimes even haphazardly. Certainly, we learned, as is described in detail in the report, that a meaningful number of state and local governments and the organizations that represent them were quite disappointed in the depth and timing of consultation. So we ultimately came to the conclusion, as you see, that the processes of consultation could be substantially improved across agencies, noting that there is at least one agency, which we describe specifically in the report, that appears to have looked closely at the matter of effective consultation and has endeavored to create more formal procedures to guide the processes of dialogue among federal, state, and local stakeholders. This report, we hasten to add, is not the place to parcel out any blame for what has not happened. And we also acknowledge, thus far, and we also acknowledge that there has perhaps been some uncertainty about how the processes of regulatory review by OIRA in the schemes going back to EO 12866 during the Reagan administration, continuing through EO 13132 and to the present, should actually be conducted and implemented. And moreover, what should the White House's role be in this overall process? So our overall conclusion and recommendations in this space focus on ways in which the process can be improved, specifically with respect to the development of agency policies that are well designed to foster and facilitate collaboration. And let me just conclude my remarks to say this, again, from a rather big picture perspective, and speaking again here of state and local consultation. The goals and objectives of consultation with state and local governments are, in our view, critical to the improving both the quality of agency decision-making and also its transparency and accountability in our system of administrative governance. And we very much appreciate ACUS's focus on this issue, and we hope as consultants that we contributed something meaningful to this endeavor.
Thanks so much, Dan.
I'll turn it over to Seth.
Thank you, Carl. So I'll briefly summarize some key points about tribal consultation from our report. I'll start with respect to methodology by just adding that we conducted a listening session on tribal consultation as well, outreach to tribal governments and intertribal organizations, studied in detail 21 agency policies on tribal consultation and 116 comments available in regulations.gov on proposed agency actions where tribal consultation was discussed. So the first key point that I'll note is that the report explains how tribal consultation is a unique form of intergovernmental relations with a specific legal meaning. As Executive Order 13175 recognizes, there's a unique political and legal relationship between tribal nations in the United States, known as the nation-to-nation relationship, which entails, among other things, the trust responsibility that the United States owes to tribal nations. So tribal consultation refers to a form of nation-to-nation relations and communication that involves formal dialogue between tribal leaders and federal decision makers. Just put simply, it's government-to-government dialogue. So give an example of this, the Department of Transportation's policy defines consultation as follows. It says consultation, quote, refers to the affirmative responsibility of the federal government to proactively seek to engage in meaningful, timely, and clear exchange of information between federal and tribal officials with decision-making authority on a proposed policy that has tribal implications or on a matter that affects a tribal interest. So the report explains that many agencies like the DOT have adopted tribal consultation policies. The federal executive has worked to create uniform standards for tribal consultation. Although there are salient differences among agency policies, the proliferation of these policies reflects this work to develop uniform standards. And for this reason, we carefully studied 21 examples of agency policies to identify common ground, differences, and considerations for best practices. We also studied the existing literature, the interviews that we conducted, the comments on proposed agency actions to identify what the serious concerns are about implementation of Executive Order 13175 and these policies. The second key point that I'll emphasize is that the report also identifies similarities between tribal consultation and state and local consultation, as well as other forms of agency engagement. Many potential benefits are similar. These include improving regulatory policymaking, eliminating undue burdens, and integrating actors and institutions with comparative expertise and local knowledge into agency decision-making. And I highlight this because of the way that these points relate to prior ACUS work. The case for robust tribal consultation is similar in important ways to the case for robust public engagement in agency decision-making. And this is an area where ACUS has taken a lead already in making recommendations to agencies. And our report and recommendations have drawn on ACUS's prior work. For example, ACUS recommendation 2018-7 provides that, quote, public engagement should generally occur as early as feasible in the rulemaking process, including when identifying problems and setting regulatory priorities, end quote. And the preamble to this recommendation explains that, quote, robust public participation is vital to the rulemaking process. By providing opportunities for public input and dialogue, agencies can obtain more comprehensive information, enhance the legitimacy and accountability of their decisions, and increase public support for their rules, end quote. And as we explain in the report, we think the case for robust tribal consultation is even stronger. Our report and the draft recommendations about intergovernmental consultation are consistent with on engagement in agency decision-making processes. The third point I'll highlight is that much of the report and the draft recommendations discusses the need for comprehensive and detailed agency policies on tribal consultation. And here we're synthesizing from those existing policies that I've already referred to. I won't rehearse all the details here, but I'll highlight a few of the most important components. We think agency policies should require consultation as early as feasible in the decision-making process. Agency policy should be available on regularly updated consultation web pages that designate in-house experts as points of contact. Agency policy should ensure that agency officials and staff are equipped with adequate structures, resources, and knowledge to implement the policies. An agency should keep track of their compliance with their policies and revise them as necessary. For instance, when new insights about best practices. Fourth and finally, another important finding was that successful tribal consultation may require additional resources on both the agency and tribal sides. We listened carefully to interviewees who consistently highlighted this concern. And what they told us was consistent with the findings in the GAO and CRS reports on tribal consultation upon which our report built. So first, we were interested to learn about creative ways to streamline access and reduce the cost of participating in consultation, including ways to do the most with what agencies and tribes already have. These included the creation of a centralized tribal consultation webpage that would be a one-stop shop for tribal governments to access information about all ongoing executive branch consultation opportunities. And with respect to the need for additional resources, given the concern about current resource levels and coordination, we offered recommendations not only to agencies, but also to OMB and Congress. So I look forward to our discussion of the draft recommendations and want to thank Bakaja, Dan, everyone at ACUS who worked on this project, and everyone who talked with us for making it possible.
Thank you so much, Dan and Seth. And thank you so much for the report. Despite being a challenging time for research, I commend you on the thoroughness of the research and the report. So I'm going to lean on you too heavily during the deliberations on the recommendations, and I appreciate you two being here. So just to kind of give you a sense of the process going forward, we will go through the recommendations first, one by one. What I will do is, announce recommendation 1, for example, give you a chance to read it, to reflect on it, and to offer comments. There have been some comments that have been pre-submitted that we'll discuss when we get to those parts of the recommendation. For those recommendations that have multiple subparts, what we'll typically do is try to read the whole recommendation with all its subparts, but then we'll go through with respect to feedback subpart by subpart. What we'll try to do is avoid as much as we can the wordsmithing, which is sometimes unavoidable, and the lure of it is powerful. But what I hope we'll do is that we'll focus on revisions that make substantive changes to the recommendations and focus our debate and deliberation on that, as opposed to the cosmetic changes, those revisions that involve cosmetic changes. And for those that involve more cosmetic changes, we'll just try to get agreement on those pretty quickly. But before going recommendation by recommendation, I just wanted to get general comments from committee members or those who are here about the report, and then we'll start with the recommendations. Jeff.
Well, thanks. I was going to suggest that we do this. I guess I have just 2 questions. I think the report's a great addition to the literature on this subject. First question was raised or came to me when I saw the first footnote in the recommendation, where the conference is doing a report that also touches on territorial governments. And I realized that the executive order on state and local governments doesn't only cover states, and define states in a way that doesn't include territories or the District of Columbia for that matter. But there are local governments and territories, and there are also Indian tribes and territories. And I just wanted to know if we should say something about that at some point, or what, maybe even that the report should mention, why that's being walled off. That's my first question, or first thing that I wanted to raise. The second one's more of a technical one, and maybe Alex from OMB can help on this one. But I was a little surprised that the report didn't say more about the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. Dan mentioned it in his presentation, but that act has a lot of requirements for agencies in analyzing impacts on state and local governments. And there's this one paragraph on page 12 of the report that I didn't quite understand. It says, we should note that this executive order applies, as is the case with other executive orders that involve OMB regulatory review, to rules whose fiscal impact is greater than $100 million, consistent with the conditions of the Unfunded Managed Reform Act. Well, I'm not sure that, first of all, I'm not sure that all the executive orders that involve OMB regulatory review necessarily are limited to those that have are economically significant. But the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act doesn't, it says in the heading that it only applies to significant rules, but it doesn't say that it only applies, I mean, that less than, rules that have less than $100 million with an impact on state and local governments shouldn't also analyze those effects. Moreover, under UMRA, the $100 million figure is adjusted annually for inflation. And I just ran the numbers and it would be about $209 million now. So I guess I'm just wondering why that act doesn't have more of a prominent role in agencies having to analyze the impacts on state and local governments. And also, I guess I'd ask Alex from OMB's perspective if my question, maybe he can answer my question about how OMB deals with this, because you have to do it. OMB has to do an annual report under the Regulatory Right to Know Act, which includes summary of analyses done under UMRA. So those are my two questions.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So I'll start by seeking comments from both Dan and Seth on the first question, report on territorial governments and on UMRA, and then I will ask if Alex has any responses as well. So let's start with Dan and Seth first.
Sure, I'll thank Jeff for both of those. Let me take the easier one first. Although again, I'm not sure my answer will be fully satisfactory. We became aware, I'll speak for myself in this. I became aware after we undertook the study and agreed and really was, I think maybe in one of our first interviews, that ACUS had actually been in the process of doing a study that included territories in with respect to some of that. And that was news. I'm not saying that I should have known or we should have known, but that we kind of very early on, I think after that interview, were kind of came to the agreement. And the we here, I think it was myself, Seth, and Bakaja, and whomever else Bakaja consulted with, is that we just were hiving off for the purpose of our report, anything having to do with territories. So you raise an excellent point with respect to local governments and all of that. But I'd say that just as a matter of triage in our study and what we looked at, we sort of didn't take a dive into issues that involve the territories in really any respect, with respect to interviews or solicitation of comments and others. And frankly, I can't speak to what the other consultants were doing with respect to the other study that included territories and how much that overlapped with this or that. A great point with respect to unfunded mandates, and let me answer it in a way that hopefully doesn't come across as defensive, because we may need to do some additional work in this regard. First, let me say, as to the number, that's a really good catch. What we did at one point in the editing and with the input that we got from the committee early on is change most of the sections I did that had some cutoffs in terms of the monetary amount. And change that to significant rules. So as a way of not defining the line, and again, this was more by reference to the executive order than the act, not defining our recommendations about consultation in a way that would limit them strictly to a numerical figure. And furthermore, not defining what is significant in some ways, which again, in part of this conversation may be an elision from what we want to get at. So we didn't, this was, I want to go back and maybe reframe this, certainly to remove the 100 million figure for just the reasons you said. Now, I understand that doesn't respond to your larger point, which is the way in which maybe the focus there's inadequate focus on the requirements that come from the Unfunded Mandates Act, why it doesn't have more prominence. So let me just try this as maybe part of an explanation. As you well know, and as you well summarize, the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act speaks to a mandate, a requirement that state and local interests let's focus now specifically on state interests, must be taken into account because of the problem of unfunded mandates. And there ought to be a due accounting. I'm not using the right language from the statute with respect to that. It doesn't, though, go into as much detail about exactly what consultation should take place in the process by which the agencies now I want to go back and look at the exact language. I don't want to be heard to say there's no expectation of any consultation or any expectation of dialogue. But when we went back, and I remember when I went and looked at the act, I couldn't necessarily pull from there anything that indicated that UMRA had required consultation, had detailed what that consultation entails, and that in our study, agencies had in essence not been in compliance with and had not been adequately attentive to what the statute had required, okay, in that regard. Now, maybe that was too narrow a way to look at it. And so I totally take your point. Maybe in thinking about where the federal government has made clear expectations of consultation for all the goals we talk about, the focus that is in the report now, which is largely on the executive order, 13132, and other sort of attendant executive orders, should the UMRA should have at least as much pride of place with respect to the federal government's intention that there be greater consultation, and totally open to that and appreciate the feedback and want to incorporate those thoughts in that part of the report, and happy to hear any other suggestions.
If I could just add one thing, I think in section 1534 of UMRA, it does refer to consultations with elected officials of state, local, and tribal government. And then in 1532, it says that the agency has to describe the extent of those consultations. So there's more than just an analysis requirement in the act. There is a consultation requirement.
Right. Thank you for that. Sure.
So I would just briefly add, if I could, Bertrand, on the territorial government piece, this is actually an issue that came up in some of the conversations we had. I think it's an important issue. As Dan said, in discussions with ACUS staff, we concluded that we should, encourage the other reporters whose remit includes territorial governments to take a look at this issue. There are indigenous peoples in some of the U.S. territories, but in keeping with our mandate to look at Executive Order 13175, which focuses on federally recognized Indian tribal governments, we did not engage with the question of indigenous peoples who are, whose homelands are within the U.S. territories. There's at least, I think, one territory, I think it's the Northern Mariana Islands, that in its particular, the legal documents governing its particular relationship with the United States has some sort of consultation right. And so, I do think that that's just an example of why this is an important issue that, I think will be engaged with by the consultants whose mandate includes the territories. But I definitely agree it's important. And I also agree about integrating UMRA, including the piece about, calling out specifically the piece about consultation with tribes as, one of the statutory bases for a tribal consultation requirement. We could incorporate that, I think, quite quickly into the report and see whether there's more to build out from that on the tribal side as well.
Thanks, Seth. And then Alex, I don't know if you have anything further to say in response to Jeff's question on UMRA.
So I think Jeff raises two excellent points. I mean, I'll just echo, I think, some of what was said with respect to territorial governments. OMB's understanding was that the scoping of this project wasn't focused on that, but we, of course, think that that's an important aspect of agencies' for our agencies to consider in regulatory policy rulemaking. With respect to, with respect to UMRA, again, I think Jeff makes some excellent points. As he notes, the scope of WIRA's review under executive orders is not exclusively bound to the $100 million figure. Trying to think what else I can say that's useful. I agree with Jeff. I think his implicit suggestion that maybe UMRA could feature a little bit larger in these recommendations. So I think maybe as we go through, we could consider whether additional references would be appropriate here. And otherwise, I'd just say that, of course, as with other aspects of agency actions, UMRA and the analysis that agencies are doing under it are, of course, something that OMB considers as it reviews agency regulatory actions. So I know that's painting with a broad brush, but I'm not sure I can go into more details than that at the moment. Yeah. So thank you.
So can I just jump in? I know Bill Funk has his hand up, but just can I jump in on this?
Sure.
Just 100% on the UMRA again. Want to reinforce the need, thanks to the comments, to foreground that much more. On the 100 million, again, I want to be clear that at least from my part, I'm not at all wedded to in making these recommendations that figure cutoff. But we'd love to get input from this group today about whether there should be a cutoff in any respect. My inclination is to leave it at significant rules without a definition of money, but that's not our call in some fundamental way. So any input on that, I think, would be very welcome.
Thanks, Dan. And we'll think about sort of where UMRA might fit in as we work through the recommendations one by one. Bill.
Okay. Thank you, Virgil. And I have to say, I haven't had a chance to read the report yet. So to the extent that any questions I raise here are in the report, just say, read the report to me. But one thing that struck me was I didn't see a definition of regulatory policymaking. And I wondered, I hope it would be broadly considered. I mean, we talked about UMRA, which is not necessarily regulatory in one sense, but certainly imposes requirements. And I think of HCFA regulations as being other kinds of regulations that, certainly impact people. So, I mean, I don't know if we need a definition or whether just in the preamble we need to make clear that this is a broad concept of regulatory policymaking. So that's one point. The other point was, Dan mentioned making policy and implementing policy. And in my experience, actually, the biggest area for consultation with tribes and state and local government was not in making the policy, but in implementing the policy. That is, in permitting, licensing, and I take it that the remit for this recommendation is limited to policy making as opposed to permitting and licensing per se. And if I'm right about that, that's just the way it has to be. I guess that's the remit. But I wondered, Dan and Seth, in the communications you had with state and local governments and tribes in particular, whether they brought up the concept of problems of consultation in permitting and licensing. In addition, did they sort of bundle those as common problems, or did they really focus on the policy making issue?
I'll turn that over to Dan and Seth once again to answer that.
Seth, you want to go there? I have a couple thoughts, but Seth, you want to?
So, Bill, I think that comment is right on and is reflected in the report. We say in a section of the report dealing with the scope that we understand that it was originally framed around regulatory policy making with respect to the two executive orders that we've already referred to. We then explain that, however, in the course of our research, we discovered that to an extent, it's not sensible to limit it just to, say, notice and comment rulemaking or something like that because of two reasons. One, which you've already gestured at or already identified, what you hear from what you see in the literature, what we heard from our interviewees, was that issues around consultation come up in things like licensing or permitting. The second piece I'll add is if you look at the development, at least on the tribal consultation side, so the development of tribal consultation policies, the development of the the legal analyses of it, the history of it, and so on, it is broader than, say, just notice and comment rulemaking. And so in our report, we really tried to push for a broad understanding of regulatory policy making that would allow us to cover what we thought was the appropriate scope of the problem.
Little dad, 100%, both on Seth's comments and Bill, you're useful. I won't say just read the report because I'm not sure that we do define that in some way, but certainly the spirit of it is broader than, certainly broader than notice and comment rulemaking. And you'll see when we get to one of the recommendations, we specifically reference, guidance documents, guidance broadly defined as including all of that. Whether we dig as deeply into implementation, taking your good point about where the rubber hits the road with respect to a lot of that, maybe a little bit in the eye of the beholder, but you're absolutely right. A lot of the comments that we received coming back, as Seth has said, from state and local governments themselves really focused in on the permitting, what would fall into the rubric of implementation in exactly the way you described.
Bertrand, could I just follow up on that?
Sure.
Then as we go through the recommendations, should we be thinking about to what extent can we push this to include implementation? I mean, guidance I take as policy making. I'm thinking of really just plain permits and licenses, and maybe this is something also for the ACUS people. Would that be too far from our remit on this thing, even to change the title from regulatory policy making and implementation as being the thrust of the thing? I mean, I wonder to what extent the consultation is the same or somewhat different if it's policy making that's sort of national in basis versus permitting, which tends to be more local thing. And maybe it's a different kind of consultation. So maybe it shouldn't be considered all as part of the same thing. But that's my question.
So let me just see if Jen Sellen will want to chime in. She's a consultant on the other ACUS project that includes territorial governments. And she may have something to say on both the territorial government side and the implementation piece. Jen, is that?
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. I apologize for not having my camera on. I'm kind of pre-physical therapy right now and not ready for. So yeah, we are doing the consultation with state, local, tribal, and territorial project. The way that we are framing it is first we talk about the relationships between federal agencies and each of the 4 different types of governments that we explore. And we really start with statutory frameworks that either suggest or require collaboration between these different types of governments and federal agencies. So that would include things like licensing and permitting, implementation questions. Anytime a statutory law actually goes and says, agency, you should think about this or consult with this group or talk to this implementation or talk to this government in the implementation process. So we catalog all the different statutory frameworks across the U.S. code and put them into categories. Then we discuss how federal agencies take those statutory frameworks and then move them through the implementation process, both in terms of communication between the partnerships, as well as more broader federal concerns. So that's sort of an overview of that project. I would worry slightly that if we were to extend this particular series of recommendations, which our understanding was really towards consultation in regulatory policymaking, broadly defined, that there would be significant overlap with the implementation report, which we've spent, we're now on, we did a preliminary report that we are happy to share with everyone that was a Council of the Chair report, and did a series of surveys with government officials and are now writing up the report. So it's been about 2 years that we've been working on that project.
Right. Thank you, Jen. I hope you will help us police the line between your report and this report for this committee. The link to the project page for this report has been added to the chat by Kaja. Thank you for adding that. So if people want to take a look either now or later, it's available to you there. David.
At the outset, I have a concern of a rather different nature. It's one thing to say legislation or regulatory actions. If a proposed action is under consideration that will affect various entities in certain ways, then thou shalt consult. But it's quite a different matter for ACUS to start off a recommendation saying agencies shall do this or that. So what agencies are we talking about? This or that, paragraph 2 is to establish policies, paragraph 1 to designate officials, but something like HHS or Homeland Security, we've got agencies within agencies and agencies. For purposes of drafting this recommendation, what agencies are we talking to? Who should do these things or consider doing these things? And under what circumstances? So I think that it's not a good idea for us to say at the outset, agencies should do this or that. And incidentally, if it's going to be all agencies in a multi-agency department, that does not sound very efficient. That there ought to be some consideration of doing it in a way that will avoid duplication of these things we're saying agencies should do.
Thank you, David. So without engaging in the particulars of the recommendation, do you have the general thoughts on Dan and Seth on, the decision to focus generally on agencies as opposed to disaggregating in particular or focusing on particular agencies?
No, I appreciate the comments. Again, I'll speak for myself. I guess we came at it. Certainly, my thought was we came at agencies using that omnibus and maybe too much phrase, so as to make clear that we were not limiting our recommendations to the four corners of what the EO required, which of course is limited to executive branch agencies, at least at present. You have to, again, once to go back and look at UMRA to see whether or not there's some delineation of exactly who's covered in that regard. So we meant it to be broad and to include all agencies. But to be frank, we didn't, I certainly don't recall us taking the deeper dive into how we deal with agencies within agencies. I take the point about the inefficiencies, and maybe we have some language in there. I'm not seeing it on the screen share here that talks about the appropriate officials or the appropriate, or, I don't know what we call feasibility limitations with respect to that. But I suspect that would not mollify your concern, at least with respect to, which I share, with respect to avoiding the incredible duplication or triplication, whatever, of efforts that would be required if, to use your example, HHS had to, all the way down the decision tree, had to have a federalism official for all different parts. So we welcome some ideas about how to limit the scope of that. I guess the only part that I feel maybe a little more strongly about is that we not go in the opposite direction and be very severe about limiting, and I don't take this to be your point, be very severe about limiting the scope of the recommendations to just executive branch agencies, those that would be covered by, OIRA review under typical executive orders.
Where I'm coming from, as a longtime staffer at ACUS working on drafting loads of recommendations, is when we send this out, whatever ACUS adopts, when we send this out and say, please consider following our recommendation, whoever's going to see this is going to ask, well, do I have to do something? Who has to do something in order to implement this? And that's why I'm concerned about when we say agencies should do something. My concern is at an agency, whether it's the internal one or the larger one, who has to do something in order to implement this? That's where I'm
I
coming
should
from.
also add, and I don't want to step on Seth's comments here, not meaning to be evasive, but is there ways that ACUS has dealt with that in other, I mean, I can go back and of course look at other recommendations. So how typically in ACUS recommendations that are designed to, you know, recommend things to agencies, how is it typically done?
Right.
Yeah,
that's and this is something that we'll just have to address in the very first recommendation that we discuss. Thinking about how to, you know, whether we want to use the term agencies or how to refocus it. So let's keep that as part of the conversation as we move to the first recommendation. I don't know if you had anything to add, Seth.
The report works off the definition of agency that's in 13175, which in turn refers to 44 USC 35021. But I agree that we don't want to create confusion, say, within departments. I wonder whether that could be handled in the preamble or maybe it is handled in the body of the recommendations. But I agree with the core point.
Thanks, Seth. Jeff. Jeff, you're muted. You're mute. You're still on mute.
One way that ACUS has handled this in the past is to say something along the lines of agencies that have activities that affect state and local governments should do blah, 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 that sort of thing. But I was really going to comment on Bill's question. By the way, UMRA only affects excludes independent agencies as well. So I don't think we want to do that in the recommendation. But Bill's comment about definition of policymaking, the Executive Order 13132 has a definition of policies that have federal implications, and it's reproduced in the report on bottom of page 11. And it's fairly broad. I mean, it refers to regulations, legislative comments or proposed legislation, and other policy statements or actions that have substantial direct effects on states, on the relationship between the national government and the states, or in the distribution of power and responsibility among the various levels of government. So the word actions would seem to include permitting. If we used that sort of a definition taken from 13132. I'm not sure what the other executive order says, but I think that's one guidepost for us.
Thanks, Jeff. Seth?
Yeah, so there's a similarly broad definition of policies with tribal implications, which is one of the key operative trigger for consultation obligation under 13175. And this broad definition does include other policy statements or actions.
I like that a lot, and I agree with that. I don't know whether that raises the concerns that Jennifer raised before about possible overlap. Again, I haven't seen the report, so I can't really speak to that. But I like it. I mean, that is, and apropos of Bill's comment, maybe we need to, to even be more explicit in drawing from that in terms of the definition to tee up the recommendations made.
Is there a difference between collaboration and consultation?
Well,
Jennifer's report talks about collaboration.
Partnerships.
Dan, do you have a distinction between collaboration or consultation?
No, what I was going to say, I mean, this is, I don't know how helpful it is. I take collaboration to be sort of the second order goal. I mean, you want there to be collaboration. That's sort of the ultimate goal. Consultation is a part of that. It's not the only part of that, but it's a key part and element that includes collaboration more generally. But I understand what you're getting at, Jeff, is whether it has a term of art meaning in the context of what's called for in the other report. And once again, I don't know enough about the other project to opine about that.
If we're looking for a dividing line, then maybe that's one.
I did just want to jump in and note that the definition, policies that have federal implications as well as tribal implications, is defined in the preamble as a footnote. So just to let you
know. Jen, Sela?
Thanks. I would like to say that I would agree that it seems like a consultation, or at least the way that we have been framing our work, is that consultation is a part of a larger collaborative process. And so our our recommendations, as at least as envisioned now, are really focusing more on like the managerial aspects of trying to facilitate healthy working public partnerships and relationships. And so understanding where they originate, and then the constraints on them, and then how they move forward on a day-to-day basis. And it was sort of our understanding that this project was more in terms of how do we facilitate the communication aspect, the consultation aspect of those partnerships. And so I think in our heads, we're sort of not necessarily going to spend a lot of time on consultation and communication, because we felt that's where you guys were going, and that you guys would do, a quite better job at it than we ever could. So that's sort of how in our heads we separated things out. But of course, given that you guys are much later in the process, we're happy to steer our project around the areas that you want to carve out.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Dan, you took your mic?
I agree. I agree with that scoping as was said. But of course, I can't speak for ACUS in terms of how you draw those lines.
And we'll draw those lines, figure out how to draw those lines as we work through the recommendations. Are there any other general comments on the recommendation report before we start to go through each of the recommendations one by one? I imagine a lot of these issues that are raised will come up again as we think about how to and whether to revise the recommendations. Seeing no hands, let's proceed with recommendation 1. Again, I'll give you an opportunity to read and also a pause to give you an opportunity to raise your hand if you want to make a comment or offer feedback on the recommendation. So let's start with recommendation number 1. Are there any comments or feedback on the first recommendation? Elena Ness.
Yes, hello. Along the lines of the conversation we were just having a minute ago, when you say coordinate, do you mean the same thing as consult, or does that have a different meaning?
You said coordinate did that have the same meaning as, I forgot, I missed the word that you use.
Consult.
Consult, okay, got it, thank you.
Sorry, I got a new laptop in my office and I'm still figuring out all of my audio.
Yeah, no, it's all good. I got that was the only word I missed. Thank you.
I think for me, I also deal with a statute that refers to coordinate in one place and consult in a different place. And so to me, those words have different meanings. But if we mean the same thing, then maybe we should use consultation in recommendation number 1.
Got it. Thank you, Elena. So the proposed revision would be to change coordinating to for consulting.
Yes.
Thank you. Jeremy.
Briefly, I think we meant coordinating consultation. Like, this is not the official who actually does the consultation, but helps coordinate consultation processes.
Okay. So could it be for coordinating consultation with state and local government?
That would work for me.
Okay. So that's another opportunity to shift it. Any thoughts on that revision?
I'm okay with it. I mean, for what it's worth.
Okay, thanks.
I appreciate the suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Having heard no objection, we'll make that change to recommendation 1. Are there any other comments or feedback on recommendation 1? Okay. So recommendation 2 has multiple parts. So we'll start with Stephanie, Liaison Representative Stephanie Davis's comments, and her recommendation would be to reorder these. Jeff, are you on 1 or you moved to 2?
I mean, I think we need to resolve at some point David's comment about agencies.
Absolutely.
And limiting them. And Jeremy probably has some language in his back pocket from some recommendation where we've done that.
Yeah.
Where we've limited to those agencies that affect state and local government in some way. but we have to come back to that at some point, I think.
Sure. I mean, I think it would be the best time is when it's first mentioned in the recommendations. Of course, there could be a definition of agencies that's added to the preamble as well, as a possibility. But whatever that definition is, whether it's in the wherever we put that definition, we still should decide on what that definition
I
is.
think we should put it right up front in the first recommendation, so agencies, know if they're covered or not.
Right. So any thoughts on changes in or defining more, I guess clearly, I don't know, clearly is the right word, but defining agencies in that first recommendation. Jeremy, do you have sort of thoughts on?
At least speaking to recent ACUS practice, we've tended just to speak to agencies generally, and we sort of let agencies sort out, for example, whether it'd be better to centralize it within HHS or allow FDA and CMS to have their own processes. So, I mean, I can't actually point to any sort of specific language in recent recommendations. As to the EO and UMRA themselves, they speak to agencies. So that's sort of why we went with the term agencies.
Right, but I think, where we made a recommendation on adjudication, we would say something like agencies that conduct adjudication should, I mean, we have limited some of our recommendations in that way.
So Jeff, yours is less the agencies within agency problem that David is speaking of, but it's really targeting the appropriate agencies that have collaboration or consultations with, or do work that has federalism implications or tribal implications.
Yes, I mean, I think I would let departments kind of sort out how they do it within their sub agencies and all that.
Right.
We might want to just flag that issue, but I wouldn't try to prescribe that. But I would try to limit it to I mean, if some agencies don't have any relationships with state and local governments, I mean, for example, should ACUS designate a federalism official?
I think we have a tribal consultation official.
Do we? Okay.
I believe it's Sean if she's on the call. But yeah, I mean, most of these requirements speak to agencies generally. I mean, obviously, the EO, when it says designate a federalism official, speaks to agencies generally. I don't think there's any limitation on which agencies. I see Dan has his hand up.
The EEO does, but that doesn't mean that ACUS does. It has to.
Dan or Seth, do you have thoughts on sort of whether we should, your report or recommendations on limiting it?
Well, I have a question that may come across as naive in this group, but I'll ask it anyway. One area that state and local consultation comes up that we heard a lot about, it won't surprise you, is in area of land management. And so if you think of Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, and on and on and on, are those bureaus treated as agencies for those purposes? I think that state and local governments would be quite disappointed if all that has to happen is the Department of Interior has to designate a federalism official, since when the rubber hits the road, all these bureaus and all these departments and dealing with them. So I would have thought that the intention would be that BLM and others have are dealing with these issues and would have federalism officials. So I don't know if that would be. Anyway, I guess what I'm asking is, are those agencies for the purpose of in ACUS lore and federal lore?
So my approach would, I think, help that, because if we said agencies that have a lot of dealings with state and local governments, that would.
It would, yes, and I echo that. And that's that's not a concrete idea, Bertrand, but I want to echo Jeff's point about making sure that because I think that'd be really important in terms of the implementation of these.
So Jeff, do you want to make a do you want to recommend a revision to say agencies that have dealings with state and local government in the first recommendation?
Something like that, man. That's not the best, phrase perhaps, but yeah, something like that.
Okay.
Maybe Bill has better language.
Yeah, we could deal with the wordsmithing later, but get the general gist of what you're putting forth. Comments and thoughts on that proposed recommendation, not for its beauty, but for its substance.
Kind of skips over the whole point of the recommendation. Once they have dealings, they're consulting. It's more along the lines of that are considering actions that implicate or state and local and tribal governments, or that have that may have effects upon them, something like that.
So agencies that are considering actions implicating state and local governments should designate.
Yeah, something more like that. Yes.
Okay. So
Well, I would say more than just considering, but that's
my point was to get rid of the word dealings, because
yeah,
dealings means they're
can,
already consulting.
I accept that point. Yeah.
This is wordsmithing.
yeah, that's wordsmithing. I agree, Bill. So that's kind of the general gist. We'll come back and let sort of folks at ACUS figure out what the right exact terminology is, and come back on our next meeting to see if that works for us. But do people, in terms of the substance of that recommendation, are there points of agreement, disagreement, Bill?
Hands up for something else.
Oh, it's for something else. Okay, thanks. Okay, we will accept that recommendation at this point if there are no objections. Okay. Bill, are you still on recommendation 1 or to 2?
No, I'm still on 1.
Okay.
Add at the end, regulatory policy making and implementation.
Implementation. Okay. So insofar as this recommendation is dealing with consultation, I assume that doesn't cross the line to your project, Jennifer?
No, I certainly don't think it does. This is exactly what Dan was talking about with BLM and Forest Service issues, that it's the implementation rather than the policy making usually, although management plans could be considered policy making, but
okay.
Yeah, I would agree that I think that the regulatory part, like the qualifier, is definitely important in this sentence. But yeah, I think given the fact that the report itself considers regulatory policy making more broadly to include certain aspects of implementation, I think we're fine.
Okay. Thanks, Jennifer. Any objections to Bill's proposed change? Any other sort of comments or suggested revisions with respect to recommendation number 1? I assume that's an old hand, Bill, or a new hand?
old hand.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so let's move forward to recommendation 2. And I'm going to start with Stephanie Davis's recommendation. I don't know if she is. Stephanie, are you on the call with us right now?
She is not on the call today.
Yeah, okay. So I don't know if you have any thing you want to share further other than what's in the comments regarding your suggested revision.
I don't think she had anything else, just straightforward. She was just saying whether or not it should be reorganized based on what was written.
Great. So the reorganization would be to move E to first. I think E would be first, and it'd be E, C, B, A, and then the rest in order in the order that it's in. So I don't know in terms of whether you guys could whether you want Bakaja to move it around so we can see what it looks like, or whether you're okay just looking at it as is. Bill.
I can look at it where it is, and I think it's in the right place. I mean, I think you start with the general and get more specific, and options, I think, are getting more specific than what precedes it. So I think it's in the right place.
Okay. Elena?
It's not directly on the list. It's a little bit in D, but I think you first have to identify whether federalism is implicated in the first place before you need to worry about any of these things.
Okay. And so would that mean you're moving something about whether there are federalism implications, or it should consider whether there are federalism implications as A, or?
Yes.
Okay. So it's kind of to describe. So it's weird because there's like the should describe in the sentence that precedes it. So we have to think about how we would restructure that part. Dan.
So this has some nuance behind it. So I just want to unpack it a little bit.
Okay.
Right now, the agencies and and Bakaja knows I need to put this into the report a little and in the next draft a little more conspicuously, because I went back and did some deep dive into through the Federal Register of agencies that actually prepared these federalism summary impact statements as they're required to under the EO. And what I found, I guess not all that surprising, is in nearly every case, there was a boilerplate sentence that basically said the agency looked at this and decided there are no federalism impacts, and then that was it. And so clearly the spirit of our recommendations here is we need the agencies, we recommend that the agencies be more explicit and fulsome with the criteria for determining whether there are federalism impact statements, because of the fear that they're engaging in really a box checking enterprise, as we put it in some ways. So we don't want to, my suggestion, my humble suggestion is, you don't want to say considering whether there are federalism implications. They do that already. Right. We want them to develop some processes or criteria for determining whether there are federalism implications that would give we the people more satisfaction that they have actually really looked at this issue and consulted about it, rather than just put, again, what we've observed is just, this is not about federalism. There's nothing about federalism here, nothing to see here, drive by. Yeah. See what I'm getting at? So we want to, yeah.
Okay.
Otherwise they're going to say, oh, we've been doing that all the time. We just say, it's not a federalism thing, next.
Right.
Just talked about taking what used to be D and making it A.
Yes.
Yeah, that would work.
I'm sorry, the one below that. The procedures for determining whether there are federalism implications, and making that A.
Okay.
Because that's what Dan's describing.
Yes, yes is the answer. Whoever said that, was that Bill?
That's Bill. Yeah.
I think it would be capture what we're getting at more. If again, if this committee agrees that that's a consideration in the.
Okay. So so now we have movement of D to A. Okay, so I mean, I'm still, for some reason, it's just not really making sense to me in terms of, I feel like the procedures for developing federalism implications and the federalism implication aspect of it is a little bit separate from the consultation part, but I don't know if that is of enough importance to separate them out into two different recommendation parts. So any other comments on this movement with respect to D to A? Any objections to that movement?
Just to provide some additional context of what we were thinking when we also made it this way. So the idea was, by having the criteria for effective consultation, the goals and principles and the circumstances, you're essentially setting the baseline for, if you're going to do consultation, this is what it's going or should look like. And then you're getting into specifically the procedures for determining then the options for when you're actually doing the consultation.
Got it. Bill.
Yeah, it seemed to me that the reason why the new A should be first was the procedures for determining whether there's federalism implications. Once you have those procedures and you follow those procedures, if there are no federalism implications, then you don't need to consult, right? So the criteria for effective consultation is only after you've decided that there are federalism implications, for which you need procedures to determine that. So that's why I think A should be A where it is now, and why other stuff should come later.
But what's strange to me, Bill, I don't know, or for others, I don't know if this is strange for you. It suggests that they develop procedures for determining whether there are federalism implications, and then do these other things, regardless of it seems like regardless of the answer to whether there are federalism implications. And so that's what kind of gets it's a little bit. It seems like they would have to do it all regardless of whether it's in A or D.
Well, all I can say is that if you have procedures for determining whether there's federal implications, I mean, I think it just follows that if you follow the procedures and there are no implications, then you don't have to worry about everything else.
Would
Could say as a threshold matter.
Yeah. What do you say, Jeff?
Something like, at the end of the new A as a threshold matter. I mean, if we really need to spell that out, I'm not sure we do though.
No, yeah, I don't know if that really adds more than words, but yeah. Dan, you had your hand up.
No, I'll pass. Sorry.
But the procedures aren't a threshold matter. I mean, it's for determining.
Whether as a threshold matter, there are federal implications.
Good. I like that. All right. I like that. That's wordsmithing, but I like that. Procedures for determining as a threshold matter, whether there are.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Other comments on moving D to A and the changes to A. I mean, let's first moving D to A, there are no objections. Okay. And regarding the changes to the wording of A, the new A, are there any objections? Okay. Okay, so other suggestions or proposed revisions to recommendation to Bill.
This is sort of I don't know, big issue for me. I start with criteria for effective consultation. I once was in an agency and would get the ACUS recommendations. And if I was in an agency and got a recommendation that said I was supposed to come up with criteria for effective consultation, I'd say, what the hell are the criteria for effective consultation? Isn't that what you're supposed to tell me, administrative conference? You're the experts here, all right? What are the criteria for effective consultation? I mean, that's what I'd like to see here, all right? Which is, what are the criteria for effective consultation? What are the goals and principles of consultation? I mean, I don't see why that should just be different between agencies, or why agencies should have to invent the wheel over and over again. I really think, I would hope that Dan and Seth, in their report and work, and again, I haven't read the report, but could come up with, what our criteria for effective consultation, what the goals and principles of consultation are, and that we could adopt those as being the recommendations for what the agency should do.
Dan and Seth, thoughts on criteria for effective consultation and the goals and principles of consultation?
So with respect to tribal consultation, the report identifies through analysis of agency policies, analysis of the interviews, comments on proposed agency actions, a set of important goals and principles that you can, synthesize out of what we looked at. I do think that, another point the report makes is that different agencies do have different mandates. There are programmatic, agency-specific programmatic goals related to consultation. HHS, for instance, might have goals related to improving public health outcomes that DOT wouldn't. And so there's going to be, I would think, some sort of variability in agency-specific goals and principles. But there's certainly on the tribal consultation side a lot of literature and policies out there at this point. The executive order 13175 itself talks about some principles. So there are certainly things we could draw on. They're in the report. I'm not sure whether we should try to enumerate all of them in the recommendations, if we should address this a bit in the preamble. I'm also not sure to what extent agencies, when they get an ACUS recommendation, will look back at the report to flesh out any of the specific recommendations. It sounds like maybe there's not a lot of that, which would militate in favor of, Bill, your suggestion to try to specify using what's in the report, goals and principles.
I mean, I guess a couple questions that should be raised with respect to Bill's suggestions, like the question is like generalizability. How generalizable are these criteria, the goals? Would it be too prescriptive? And if too prescriptive to say particular criteria, maybe we could provide exemplars. Dan, you were about to say something?
I really associate myself with Seth's comments. I think that, Bill, there are some parts in the report that speak to that, but I take your point about maybe they should be surfaced here in the recommendations. Maybe this was too clever in some sense to try to politic a bit, which is sort of above my pay grade and our pay grade with respect to assuaging concern, right? That we were being too prescriptive with agencies. But I take your point to be, hey, this is what a recommendation is to be prescriptive, and maybe along with the caveat, as Seth notes, of some sort of local knowledge that might be specific with the agencies. So I think we're totally open to being more prescriptive in this part of it, if this be the will of this group. And I think there's, again, enough that we did in the report. There's enough in the literature. I'm referencing, for example, the values of federalism part in at least my part of the report that could undergird something more than what's there now, which is you guys develop criteria. Because I largely agree with your sentiment.
Bill?
Thank you. I thought one thing is, instead of should describe, we could say should include, all right, which would make clear that this is not everything. This is just these things that we think are generalizable. Individual agencies have made particular things as well. And in terms of whether or not the agencies would be upset about something prescriptive, I mean, ACU's recommendations are not prescriptive in the sense of nobody has to do them, right? And in fact, one of the problems ACUS has had in the past is getting agencies to follow them, right? And in my experience, the easier you make it for the agency to adopt the recommendation, to follow the recommendation, is to give them what they can just plug in. All right. And then follow it. You tell what the criteria is and say, all right, that's our criteria. Now we have to do that. So I think the more specific we can be, the easier it is for the agencies, because they always can just ignore it or chop off what they don't like. I mean, nobody's going to hit them over the head because they somehow deviated from ACUS's recommendation, but we really want to make it easier for them to adopt it.
So if I could characterize Bill's proposal, it would be for ACUS staff to work with Seth and Dan on developing specifics regarding the criteria for effective consultation, the goals and principles of consultation, and to bring it back to the committee for our next meeting to discuss those specifics. Are there any objections? Oh, Bill.
I was going to say, you might add D to that.
Add D to that. Okay. So B, C, and D.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there objections to that proposal? All right, so we'll work on developing that prior to our next meeting in 2 weeks. Okay. Any other comments on recommendation 2? Jeff?
I guess I'm just wondering what standalone consultations mean, and maybe whether we need to spell that out in some way.
And standalone consultations, does that have a Dan or Seth particular meaning that's derived and related to your report?
I'm drawing a blank. Seth, help me out here. What did we mean?
I don't think it's a term of art. I think it's a term that is trying to capture an idea that there can be different, that sometimes you will have a consultation that occurs in the context of a specific action, right? And that's the universe you're looking at. And then in other instances, you could have a more permanent structure through which consultation occurs on an ongoing basis, like a standing advisory committee. And then I would especially stress in the tribal consultation piece of this, when we get to that discussion, there's a lot in the literature, a lot in what we learned, that, there's an expectation that tribal consultation is part of an ongoing government to government relationship, right? In which there are particular actions that have particular consultations. but I think it's trying to get at the idea that there are, there's the sort of range that I tried to describe
What if
within
we, what if we
consultation
said
will occur.
consultations on individual matters or something like that?
So the proposal will be including consultations on individual matters and standing advisory committee, and the standalone language would be deleted, I assume, Jeff?
Yeah, that's I guess where I'm going, but
Yeah.
there might be something in between as well.
Yeah.
Between
Is that capturing everything, Seth, or or no?
Well, we're in the state and local side, so I definitely would defer.
I mean, what I would add is in the spirit of what Seth said, now it's coming back to me. I think what we heard is, and again, I'm not going to be specific about what we heard from particular groups, but in the conversations with the big seven, these organizations, what they are, National League of Cities, Conference of State Legislatures, some really good suggestions about, iterative consultation, that goes on through processes that go beyond one particular piece of policymaking or implementation that are valuable. But I think the individual matters, the replacement of standalone doesn't, I mean, I don't know what Seth thinks, but it doesn't, we don't lose anything from the change. I don't think at all.
Can I also add, Bert? Oh,
Yeah, please, Seth. Seth, go ahead.
I'll just add also recommendation 8, starting at line 172, which we will get to, gets at some of this, some of what I was trying to describe. So we probably want to just keep in mind that we may, through a set of interlocking recommendations, depending on, how much changes or not, be able to get at this issue.
Okay. And then which recommendation is that again, Seth?
8, which talks about consultation on an ongoing basis, right? So that gets at the piece of ongoing that I was mentioning earlier. That might get at, Jeff, if you were saying, is there something in between, perhaps something of what's in between is gotten at by 8.
Okay, so let's put a little flag on 2 just to make sure that we have consistency with recommendation 8, and maybe when we get to 8 we may want to come back to 2E to make
something about ongoing consultation.
And perhaps add something about ongoing consultation to E. Okay. Any other comments and suggestions on recommendation 2? Bill.
I'm down to H.
Okay, coming down. Oh yeah, there we go.
The procedures the agency will use to communicate to state and local officials how the agency used their input. I mean, it's will use, used. I mean, shouldn't it be will use to communicate how the agency will use their input? Or is it both? I mean, is this, we want procedures that will tell them how we used it, or tell them how we will use it, or both?
So I imagine it is communicating with the state and local officials after the fact about how the agency used their input. Is that the gist of the recommendation?
That was the intent for this one. Oh, but I'll defer to Seth and Dan.
Yes, one word, yes. And so I appreciate that's infelicitous sentence as written.
Okay, so with the change to will use, does that properly capture what this recommendation is supposed
No, I think what Dan's saying is the will use should come out.
Yeah, so be used. Okay.
Yes.
So it's communicating what we did with it.
Right.
Correct.
Right. Okay.
Got it.
I'm happy with that.
Okay. Any other comments on 2? So let's move to recommendation number 3.
So we didn't make a change on H at all?
No, we have not made a change to H. Would you like to make a change on H? Or
I thought
change?
somebody said the will use would come out there, but
oh no, the proposed addition of will use to the second line and
okay.
was taken out. Yeah. Any comments or suggested revisions with respect to recommendation 3? Okay, so let's move forward to consultation with tribal government officials, and recommendation number 4. So this raises the first question that we had. The question we have with respect to recommendation number 1, in terms of designating or defining what the agencies are. So recommendation 1 said agencies. I mean, this is again not the beauty language. We'll update are considering actions that have implications for state and local government. Should we have that same language? It's except with reference to tribal governments in 4.
Bertrand, I can't seem to get the raise hand function to work, but can I
Oh,
speak?
no worries. Oh, no worries. Yeah, just shout out and I'll call on you, Seth. Go
Yeah.
for it.
So this is probably wordsmithing.
Yeah.
It probably, my concern, which I think is a serious one, can be addressed through wordsmithing, perhaps inspired by some of the EO itself and some of the other documents that we discuss in the report. But I am seriously concerned about how the possibility that phrasing this in an infelicitous way would exacerbate an already existing problem. And that already existing problem is agencies that don't have deep expertise in working on a government-to-government basis with tribes and don't have deep understandings of Indian country issues, tribal sovereignty issues, federal Indian law, just sort of assuming that, they're promulgating a regulation under a generally applicable statute and not even thinking about tribal nations at all. One of the things we stressed in our report is just the wide sweeping scope of subject matter, regulatory subject matter and regulatory areas that you saw comments on tribal consultation coming in 2023 and 2024. And so if it's not phrased very carefully, I think I would have a serious concern that it sort of will lead a whole set of agencies that should not ignore these recommendations to ignore them.
It's almost like if we don't have that official in place, we might not know or might not understand or recognize the implications of our policies on tribal governments.
Yeah.
Okay. Elena?
Okay, so I put my hand up for a different reason, but I do have something to say about that. And I wonder if maybe it should be a separate recommendation to develop expertise in this area. I think just designating, if you're an agency that doesn't have experience in this, just designating an official isn't going to solve the problem. So I just wanted to put that out there based on what you just said. I put my hand up to say that I think we should consider that we may need more than one tribal consultation official because the person you would need might vary based on the type of rulemaking or action that you're taking. So that was why I put my hand up. But
Got it.
So 2 things to consider.
Right. So I think the first thing, I think we've turned to it later in terms of describing the need for expertise over um, tribal government matters or with federal Indian law generally, or the trust arrangement. So yeah, so let's keep that in mind with respect to your first comment, Elena, to see if that addresses your point. And then the second point has to do with the potential for needing multiple tribal consultation officials. So so would it be just removing A and just saying or adding multiple and saying tribal government officials? How would you word your proposed change?
What about designate one or more?
Okay.
I don't have strong feelings.
Yeah.
I know we've got a lot of people with good wording suggestions here,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think just giving making it clear that it doesn't need to be one person.
Got it.
And I didn't put it in my name, but I am with the Coast Guard, and we do consultation with tribes, so
Got
we
it.
do have experience in this.
Got it. Thank you. So that's the proposed change. So we have two proposed changes on the book. So first, I want to address the first one with respect to making the same change as we did in 1 and putting it in 4 as well. Bill, I don't know if your comments related to that. If it's not, it's fine, but we'll still need to address that directly, and then we'll go to Elena's suggestion.
Well, I mean, first, let me take them backwards, which is I don't think you want multiple tribal consultation officials. Remember that this tribal consultation official will have primary responsibility for coordinating consultation. All right. In other words, there's one person who's responsible for making sure there are the right people consulting with the tribal governments. Yeah, you may have different people in different parts of the agency or whatever that are dealing with it, but one person who you can hold responsible for doing the job of making sure that consultation is taking place, even though they may be coordinating other people in the agency to do that. So I don't think you want a bunch of people or more than one person being the person who's doing the coordinating. Anyway, that's one point. And the other is I think that Seth's point of calling out the idea that a separate, and I think would be a separate recommendation, but would come before 4, be the new 4, which would be in essence to say that agencies should engage in a process to determine how they may interact or may affect how they may affect Indian tribes in their regulatory actions. What do you think, Seth, for trying to get that idea across?
Yeah, Seth or Dan.
Yeah, if it's an ongoing process, right? And not just a one-time thing, which is probably consistent with what you're saying. Yeah. So I want to think more about it. I would say I would stress that any such process has to itself be, I would think it needs to be in consultation, like they need to be thinking of reaching out on a government-to-government basis with tribes.
How about you working with the staff on the wordsmithing? I mean, I think the idea is we want something different than just appointing somebody who's going to be responsible. We want this process to think about how do you interact with, what do you do that actually affects Indian tribes that they may care about?
Yeah. And I think, there's obviously agencies that have done that. There's the EO and other presidential documents that call for that push in that direction. So I think we could wordsmith it and come back to the next meeting with something that we could review and see if we want to keep in there.
Right. Okay.
My only comment is I know we haven't gotten to this because it's the very end of the recommendations, and Seth can speak to this, but it also reinforces the recommendation about the need for resources, which is, of course, part of it that's directed toward Congress. But that's
right. I just want to. Jeremy, that'll return to Elena.
Just quick question for Bill. If we're adding this in the tribal section, would you also want this in the state and local section, since there's a similar qualifier for agencies that are considering actions with implications for state and local governments?
Well, only if Dan thinks that there is. I mean, I think agencies automatically think when they engage in national type of things, that state and local governments are going to be affected, and therefore there's some reason to consult with them. And the fact that tribes are they're not everywhere,
Sure.
right? And so you don't naturally think about them. And so I think calling that out for tribes especially is worthwhile.
Yeah.
No, I agree with that. Although I defer to Seth's judgment here about how similar or dissimilar it is with respect to that. But I absolutely echo Bill's point is that the state and local part should be clearly before their eyes and ears, in in any of these contexts. So I don't sort of see a reason to call it out. If I were reading from the agency's vantage point, I'd say, well, tell me what the N is of those that don't have an impact on state and local government. I want to, because that may be a null set.
Right. Let me just turn to Elena before getting to you, Jeff, on in response to Bill's point about the one or more tribal consultation officials. Do you have a response to the comment, or or do you want to stick with the recommendation that you proposal that you put forth?
I don't feel particularly strongly either way. I think one of the reasons I'm thinking one or more is it was either Bill or David, I'm sorry, I forget which one, posed the question of whether we should also be talking about permitting, for example. And so, when you're talking about, depending on how broad the subject matter of which you're talking about, consultation may affect whether you think one person is appropriate. So, I don't feel particularly strongly about whether we just put one or not. I mean, we have regional people who handle, particularly in like Pacific Northwest. There's a lot of tribal interest in that area, and so we have people who focus on that there, and then other people in other parts of the country. So it kind of varies based on what the needs are.
Got it. And I assume, Bill, you do feel strongly about just keeping it at a tribal consultation official. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's especially when we talk about primary responsibility, right, for coordinating. I just the idea of breaking up primary responsibility among more than one person always sort of strikes me as a bad management tool.
Okay. So if Elena doesn't feel strongly about it, unless we'll just kind of keep it at a tribal consultation official, unless someone else wants to chime in that does feel strongly about it, then we'll raise it for further discussion and a potential vote if necessary. Jeff.
Yeah, I was just playing around with some language, something for number 5 now, I guess. It would be something like agencies that have the authority to make policy or take actions that may have an impact on tribal governments should.
Okay. Okay, does that capture it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And again, we're just kind of going with the general tenor of the language, and we'll make adjustments to it.
You got should in there twice now, but yeah.
Yeah, should. Okay. Oh yeah, so this right before the should designate could be, yeah, there you go. All right. So working from the assumption that we will add 4, are folks okay with the language added to 5? And we're not necessarily gonna make a choice of the language. We have options here, and we'll present the decision at the next meeting. But just as a substantive matter, does anybody have objections to the added language to 5? Bill?
I just forgot that we should put in at the end of coordinating consultation with tribal governments and regulatory policy. Yes, you got it. You got it. All right, that's it.
Kaja's on it. Kaja is on
Very
it.
good.
Yes, absolutely. All right.
Also, my language might work on the first one too.
It might work on the first one. Yeah, we'll make sure that they're consistent, whatever language we do choose.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All righty. Okay, let's move to 6 then. 6 has multiple parts, and it's there's similar.
I'm sorry. I have. Can you look at
5
on 5I?
5, or currently 6I. Okay.
6I.
Yeah, coming down to I.
Yeah, my comment is that the way this is read, it seems like paragraph 10 discusses the kind of need for confidentiality and sensitive information, but paragraph 10 doesn't really discuss that. It discusses record keeping, I guess. But so
So it says the procedures for keeping records of consultative activities is what I refers to, including.
But it seems to stress this. So I was looking to number 10 to talk about confidential information, but it doesn't.
Oh, got it.
Yeah, Jeff, to your point, the 10 should really just stick with the first part, documenting the status or outcome, not necessarily the sensitive information point.
And then maybe you should say, see paragraph 10, move that up somewhere. Move it up a little bit in the sub.
The procedures for keeping records of consultative activities. See paragraph 10.
Paragraph 10. But actually, paragraph 18 does discuss when talking about FOIA, it talks about sensitive information, but that's different. That's a recommendation to Congress. So yeah, I'm fine with moving that up.
Okay, so now we have this is somewhat consistent with there's some differences in wording, of course, but there's a lot of similarities with the above recommendation with respect to state and local government. I think that I assume we want to follow the same recommendations as we made above with greater specificity on the goals, circumstances. And then criteria for effective. So it'll be more A, B, and C rather than D that we want to make sure we have it have more specifics on it. And then
we moved what is D
yeah, we moved
up
that
to
up.
A.
Exactly. There, that was the other change. Thank you. Okay, and then we changed standalone to consultation on individual matters, but we'll work with that language as just tentative stand-in language for now. Okay. I think that was all the changes we made. So we had on H, Stephanie, I think, had a comment on H. I can't read it from here. Let me see. Okay. So Stephanie raises that comment, and then I forgot who the stand-in for Stephanie was today.
There isn't one today. No,
there isn't one today. Okay,
No.
sorry. Okay, sorry. Sorry. Okay. So I don't know if people have any person here, members of the committee, have responses, or the consultants have responses or response to Stephanie's comment that's included in the comment box.
Well, I won't speak directly to the tribe part, but I'll say, my general answer to that comment is both. We want, folks who consult in order to learn things that they wouldn't otherwise know from the state and local governments, but also the iterative process and the ongoing consultation means that there will be folks, to use her words, that have their fingers on the pulse of, what those concerns are. They don't have to be mind readers, but they're repeat players, certainly at the state and local level. Again, referring to the Big Seven and others, they'll be more au courant with what state and local governments think about.
Right. So I don't know if Stephanie intends to just replace this entire language of this paragraph to regularly engage with tribal governments, or if she means to add it somewhere. I'm not quite sure what her suggestion is.
I think her suggestion is that if it's the point that the clause is getting at the idea that the federal staff should be people with their fingers, she would recommend replacing it or rephrasing it to the language in the quotation marks. But to Dan's point, if it's both, I don't necessarily know that we need to change it unless to further specify that it is both.
Yeah. And can you scroll over to the recommendation part, or is my screen too small? Okay. And I assume so that's kind of coming to you that
Yeah.
Um, that suggestion in terms of reducing everything here to regularly engage tribal government officials would be insufficient as to what this recommendation should be suggesting.
So I think it would be insufficient. This is one of this maybe even is the core recommendation. I was just trying to look through all the other recommendations to confirm that or not, and I hadn't finished doing so. But
I'm sorry.
This is stemming from a few things that we learned during our research process. One is we just learned about the need for principles on both the tribal side, so tribal leaders, right, and principals, decision makers on the federal agency side, to be, prepped prior to the consultation for the consultation to be successful, right? And so, staff in both governments, right, will prep folks on the topic, on issues, right, et cetera, et cetera. And that where there aren't well-established practices for doing that sort of prep, that can be an issue. So that's one thing we learned. The other thing that I believe this is getting at that I worry would be lost with the proposed change, if I've understood the proposed change correctly, is, another thing that we learned a lot about is, and this is especially true on the federal agency side, is ensuring that folks who participate in and support consultations just simply understand, say, what the trust responsibility is, right? What federal Indian law says that is relevant to, the matter at issue. What 13175 says, right? Actually, there's parts of 13175, parts that talk about let's avoid undue burdens on tribal governments, right? Let's try to pursue policies that will, devolve authority and maximize tribal self-determination that are often quite forgotten, right, on the federal agency side. So I think this is at least one of the recommendations that's really trying to get at the need for there to be practices or structures in place well prior to a specific consultation session. And that both give folks that are going to participate a grounding in what they need to be grounded in when it comes to law and history, et cetera, but especially law. And then also, trying to flag for agencies the idea that these go a lot more successful when for each particular consultation session, you have the principals come in with an understanding of sort of the scope and the not a predetermination of the issues, but an understanding of potential issues that may be raised, et cetera. I think it's trying to get at both of those things. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And can I add, Charles, just a footnote,
Yep,
quick footnote to that?
Please
Just
do.
again, by way of context, I'm not sure the report talks about this too much in the effort to not be too critical. I think there was a way maybe 15, 20, 25 years ago in which agencies tried to finesse this by designating, and the GAO report speaks about designating somebody in Office of Intergovernmental Affairs and appointing somebody who'd be in charge of sort of intergovernmental affairs and give them a remit that would include any other intergovernmental agency. So they'd be dealing with Congress, they'd be dealing with state and local governments, maybe they deal with tribal officials, and they just simply was inadequate to capture the expertise, to Seth's point, and the preparation that really gets at this. And so I sort of echo Seth's comment about developing the understanding of this, that wouldn't just be accomplished if the agency said, hey, we've long had an Office of Intergovernmental Affairs that sort of deals with all this stuff.
Before turning to you, Bill, just one sort of small note that Andrew raised in his comments. I'm just seeing now that under subheading J, it should be see paragraph 11 now if we add the new paragraph 4 or new recommendation 4. Bill.
I just want to second everything that Seth said. I thought this paragraph was very important. As someone who's had dealt with tribes in a situation where I didn't know this stuff, all right, how important it would be to have somebody who did understand it. So I think it's Stephanie's suggestion. Thank you, but no.
Okay, so we'll keep this as is. And then and if Stephanie has more to say, hopefully she'll be able to make the next meeting, or we'll be able to engage her further. Okay, so any other comments on what recommendation number are we on? Again, where recommendation number 6, I guess this is. Yeah, recommendation 6. Thank you. Okay. All right. Okay, so let's move to recommendation 7. Any suggestions, proposed revisions to recommendation 7? Yes, Bill.
Add after regulatory policies or take actions.
Regulatory policy. Is that in 7, Bill?
Yeah, so, well, 8. Oh, I'm sorry. We're
Oh,
at
7. Okay, 7. Okay, 7. Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm at
No,
8.
no worries, no worries. I'm like, where is this? All right, so let's move to 8. When agencies develop regulatory policies or take actions.
Or take actions.
Okay. Any objections to that change? Okay. So Elena.
I don't object to that change, but I think it brings us back to the earlier question of whether this covers things like permitting.
Right. And Bill, with that, is that the point of the take actions element?
It's the implementation of policy, right? It's the permitting and licensing.
Okay. So it would incorporate the permitting and licensing. So Elena, does that, are there other changes you would like to see, or?
No, not here, but I think that that may affect wording elsewhere.
Okay, so to the extent that, so we talked about regulatory policy making and implementation above. I think we just need to make sure that we're consistent to the extent that we're referring to regulatory policies, that we include something that clearly references implementation.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay.
And I think that's the point that Bill was raising earlier.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Great, thank you. So any other comments on recommendation 7 or 8, yeah, 8, I guess now. Jeff.
I would add the word normally before before proceed. So on line 180.
80 should normally proceed.
Should normally precede the issuance of a notice of proposed rulemaking, just because, in some rulemakings, there may not be a notice of proposed rulemaking, or there might be some exigent circumstance where it couldn't happen. So just
right. Okay. Any objections to that change? And then Bill.
After other forms of regulatory policy making, add or implementation. Other forms of regulatory policy making or implementation. And then when it says including development policy, blah, blah, strike the and before other forms. And then add after guidance, comma, and let's see, it says what, including development rules and issuance of permits or licenses.
Yeah. That's consistent with Elena's point to make sure that we're looking out for points of implementation. Any sort of objections to that, Bill? Is that the old hand?
No, it's an old hand now.
Okay. Elaine's old hand. Any objections to those changes? Okay. Any other suggestions or comments regarding recommendation or paragraph 8? So let's move forward to 9. And how many subparts does 9 have? Okay, it's 9, A through F. All right. Okay, so Bill.
On the second line, development and issuance of a regulatory policy or its implementation.
Can I jump in?
Yes.
Bill, would this be met? Oh, I'm sorry. Can I talk?
Yeah, Dan, yes, please.
Yeah, sorry, I should do. Would that be accomplished if it just said issuance of a regulatory action? Would that cover that?
Fine with me, yeah.
I mean, I don't want to wordsmith. You guys experts on that, but I just wondered if that would accomplish
Do you
that.
really issue an action?
Yeah, no, just as I said that, I was thinking, no, now it needs to change the rest of it. Development of a regulatory action, maybe delete and issue. Anyway, I'll shut up. You guys are
we want something to
indicate,
right? We want something to indicate there that we want to incorporate implementation.
Yeah.
And maybe regulatory action doesn't work with the issuance, but we will work on, the wordsmithing aspect of it in committee, or outside of the committee. Excuse me, Elena.
I have a pretty significant concern with the idea of an ongoing basis through the regulatory process. It creates a significant ex parte communication problem. It would require a lot, like continuous rulemaking and no final rule to keep reopening the comment period to deal with the ex parte communication problem. So I'm not sure how we resolve that, but it would be a significant problem to continually be doing consultation on a rulemaking and development.
So I don't know, Seth or Dan, you thought about the ex parte communication question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know in the interest of time whether this is the place to take a deep dive into this, but with all due respect to the comment, we don't believe there's an ex parte communication problem. We actually, my own view is that the demise of HBO versus, the HBO case, Sierra Club versus Coastal, et cetera, suggests that despite some contrary stuff in the literature and occasional cases, the notion that state and local governments would be subject to serious ex parte limitations in consultation, the rulemaking process is, shall we say, less supported by the law than it might have been 30 years ago. But
that may be the case law, but it would put me in direct violation of departmental policy.
Okay, that's well above my pay grade. Okay, so I can't speak to that.
Okay. So departmental policy, case law to think about.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm sorry we didn't take that adequately into account, but just we sort of looked at the ex parte case.
It also might come up in implementation.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll go Bill and then Seth.
But that was going to be my point, that in as much as we made it explicitly implementation, where it's an adjudication, really, the idea of off the record, ex parte is a problem. Now, I think that can be finessed by some sort of introductory language about in determining whether to have more than one consultation. Agencies, consistent with statutory and regulatory provisions, should consider.
Okay.
That would, yeah.
Okay.
So we discussed the ex parte issue as we saw it arise with respect to tribal consultation, including in, as Bill points out, adjudicatory contexts. There are agency policies that, address this issue. So, I do agree it's an issue. I hope that we can simultaneously preserve the recommendation that says in its essence, sometimes you need more than one consultation session. That we can preserve that while also, and perhaps it's through this language consistent with statutory and regulatory provisions, while also recognizing that, ex parte may be an issue.
Thanks, Seth. Andrew.
I apologize up front if this has already been mentioned. I've had a couple of distractions here. But just with the language that throughout the development and issuance of regulatory policy, do we want to also make sure would that cover deregulatory actions? Because you could have deregulatory actions, pretty significant deregulatory actions that might have a huge impacts on tribal governments, I'd imagine.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think yes, it would be my answer to that. That would be covered. The regulatory would be enough to cover deregulatory, State Farm at all. But if there's term of art language that you think would need to be more explicit, definitely be open to that.
Yeah. Andrew, do you think we need more explicit language here?
I mean, if I would be concerned, but if everyone else, particularly like if Jeff and Bill think that this would be broad enough and in practice, then I would I'm fine with it.
And Jeremy, I imagine you have a direct point related to prior recommendations.
Well, instead of trying to, because we use the term regulatory policy and policymaking throughout this recommendation, instead of trying to introduce deregulatory in every recommendation or deciding where it's appropriate, would it be sufficient in defining regulatory policymaking in the preamble to just include that regulatory policymaking includes deregulatory actions?
Yeah, I think
that was my suggestion.
Yeah, would that be sufficient, Andrew, you think?
Yeah, that'd be fine by me.
Okay, great. Let's do that. We'll add that to the preamble. Noelle.
Yeah, so I think I heard Elena mention that the ex parte sort of ongoing discussions could implicate ex parte concerns respective to agency policy as well. So I wonder if sort of consistent with statutory and regulatory provisions and agency policy or something to capture that other element that also might put folks in a, violative place.
Okay. So it could be consistent with statutes, regulations, and agency policies. Something along those lines. Okay. Okay. Jeremy.
Just one minor thing. Would it be sufficient to, I mean, it's limited to informal rulemaking, but at least ACUS issued a recommendation in 2014 on ex parte communications and informal rulemaking. Just say something like consistent with recommendation 2014. I forget what number it is.
Ooh, I like that. That's beautiful. And that covers statute, regulations, and agency policies, I assume, that ex parte communication recommendation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, it wouldn't apply to adjudications to the extent that's a concern, but that could be handled with some other language.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, so we'll look at that recommendation, try to sort that all through and make the appropriate changes to 9 and bring it back to the committee. Any other suggestions or proposed revisions to 9? And it goes through F, I think. Jeff.
I think C would have to be made consistent with the change in the paragraph.
Right. To cover implementation.
Yeah.
Okay.
So surprised Bill didn't notice that.
Yeah. All right. So we'll have to make sure that that's all in there. Okay. All right. Any other suggestions with respect to recommendation 9? Okay, let's move forward to recommendation 10 then. Yes, Jeff.
10 at the end, the last line, which may involve agency decision makers where feasible. That seems slightly odd, that language. Are we really saying, maybe it would be clearer if it said something like, which may sometimes take place without agency decision makers? Because that's really, I think, what we're trying to say, that in a listening session or informal communication, you know, maybe the agency decision maker wouldn't be there, but other staff would be. So rather than say, which may involve, where feasible, I would say, which may sometimes take place without agency decision makers.
Okay. Jeremy.
Sorry, I jump in again. I think that where feasible may be modifying the should clearly distinguish where feasible consultation from other forms of communication. I could be wrong on that, but that was my understanding.
Okay. So where feasible at the beginning of the sentence.
I mean, it may not be feasible to actually distinguish in certain circumstances, but where you can clearly distinguish a consultation from something else, do so.
Right. Okay.
I see Seth has his hand up.
Got it. Seth.
So I think that would change that would at least be inconsistent with what we said in the report. And if I understand it right, I think it would change the meaning. I think there are agency policies that I think do show that consultation, at least in the tribal context, has a specific legal meaning and it's distinct from, and the agency policy defines it distinctly from, say, a listening session or other forms of communication. And I think that's a good practice. And I wouldn't want to have a recommendation that cuts against that practice, at least in the tribal consultation context. So, Jeremy, it's totally possible I've misunderstood your point, but if I've understood it correctly, I worry that it actually is not consistent with some of what the most effective agencies are doing right now with their policies and trying to say and communicate, look, we understand there's a difference between a government-to-government consultation and say, you know, staff having an informal communication or even just having a listening session.
So was where feasible modifying involve agency decision makers? I mean, that was, I think, my...
Yeah, I think so. And, you know,
okay.
Looking back at it now, there's also kind of a difference between high-level official and agency decision maker. But I think our intent was to say, look, these more informal, you know, non-government to government dialogue, you know, instances of communication can sometimes take place without agency decision. Something like that, I think, captures what we're getting at.
Yeah, we don't need where feasible at all.
Right.
Yeah.
So would Jeff's language proposal capture adequately what you were getting at, Seth?
So I think it would. I guess the only thing I want to pause over and think about is we don't want to chill to the extent that informal communications, say at staff level, are necessary. Actually, for instance, for the successful prep work that I was talking about earlier, like the prep of the principals, we don't want to chill informal modes of communication. I think we wouldn't if we just say sometimes, but that's a countervailing concern that I have based on the findings that we had.
We said which may, if necessary, sometimes take place without.
Yeah, my reaction's a little different than Seth's, maybe. I actually think I agree with everything you said. I think Jeff's modification may capture that even better by not putting this strict where feasible part on that.
Okay.
I definitely agree with the first point about the where feasible. I mean, there's a couple comments in the literature, I think they're misguided, that sort of say, hey, there's consultation. That's what notice and comment rulemaking is about. They can submit comments. And that's, of course, not at all what captures the spirit of that. So,
right. So it would be, I guess we would take away one of those mays in line 208 because
Seth, do you want us to talk about it offline or whatever? I mean, my initial reaction is that Jeff's comment captures that, but I don't know if, that.
I think we have the idea here, and I think I probably agree with you. So I feel like we might be at the wordsmithing stage, but Bertrand, Bill's hand's been up.
Yeah. So Bill, why don't we turn to you?
Because I'm not in the wordsmithing. I'm worried with the first sentence. not the second sentence. Because in my experience, the staff interactions, all right, is where the most important activity takes place, all right? They go back and they respond to their principals, both the tribe or the state or local people. I mean, I don't know exactly who a high level official is in terms of state or local government, all right? I mean, it's a difficult concept even to be in a tribe. Who's the high level official? I mean, the chief, the president. I mean, who is it? I don't know. And those, in my experience, are, to the extent there are high level officials, nothing gets done at the high level official. They meet, shake hands, and agree. All right, because the work has already been done. Now, so that's what I'm coming in. A sort of a bigger question is, what do you mean when you say should ensure a high-level official attends such sessions? If you're saying they have to attend the working sessions, that's going to create a disincentive to have them. And so I help me out here, Seth.
Yeah. So I think this is most important in the tribal government to government context. And I think there is a risk that conflating it with the state and local causes confusion. And so I think that you're putting your finger on something that's really important to think through here and raises a question of whether we want to break out this point separately. So tribal consultation having the specific legal meaning of government to government meeting where dialogue occurs and conversation occurs, where there is a back and forth about the proposed agency action between high level officials is what we're trying to get at. That's both important given the legal meaning. It's important for respectful relations between the two governments, and it can at least be important for effective policy making. And so we want to both preserve the dynamic you're talking about, or at least I, right, based on the findings of the report, would say I think it's quite important to preserve the dynamic, the dynamic you're talking about, where a lot of work can get done, and also preserve the formal government to government consultation. So
let me ask, what about something along the lines of, at some point in consultations between tribal government and agencies, there should be an opportunity for high-level officials to meet?
Yeah, so I think we need to think, I would want to think carefully about that. That's certainly getting at the idea. I guess the question would be whether there's any inconsistency there with the specific legal meaning. Like, so, consultation is that, the government to government consultation, the core there is that high level meeting, right? And so I think what we're struggling with is sort of, there's going to be ongoing processes, one hopes, of interaction, right? And then we want to say something about there has to be that formal government to government consultation meeting, that is reflected, for instance, in the DOT's definition of consultation that I quoted in my opening remarks, where you have high-level officials there. And I think on the tribal side, it's for the tribe to decide, right? Who the leaders are and who's there. I think this first sentence was saying to agencies that we saw too much evidence in the work that we did that there is a possibility for significant misunderstanding, where agencies view having staff show up to a listening session is the actual government to government consultation, when it isn't, because it doesn't allow for an actual dialogue between people who have say about the action, the directions that the governments take. And if you start from the idea that, because it does, tribal consultation has that specific legal meaning, this is trying to implement that specific legal meaning. Does that make sense?
Yeah, let me again try to come up with, what about something you said, official consultations between tribal governments and agencies should provide should ensure that a high-level official attends such, the high-level agency official attends such meetings, such sessions. And then say the next sentence, or maybe the same sentence, but this does not preclude informal listening sessions, staff meetings between agencies and tribal governments, something like that.
I think that's getting there. I think I would then turn to Dan, because that's where I think we start to get into this question of state and local maybe not having the same specific legal meaning, and how does, perhaps we do just need to prize these apart, is kind of where I'm coming down on this. But I would want to know what Dan's views are.
No, I want to think about first. I want to think about that some more, and I appreciate you raising it. I think we need to. I think you've surfaced something that's really important. Where you started, I think, Bill, is I agree with you. Is it's obviously much looser what it means to talk about high level state and local official. I'm not so concerned with did they contact the mayor, they contact the governor per se. This might be an impact that it impacts all states or some states. I think it's a little tricky, and this is why I want to think about it more, is whether an agency basically says, hey, we contacted one of the big seven. We contacted National League of Cities, so we're good. We don't need to, and then the question is, then local governments get pissed off because, oh, we're not adequately taken into account by National League of Cities or whatever. And so avoiding going down the rabbit hole of exactly who they should consult and who is or is not a high level official for that consultation is something that we want to avoid, but also delineate a little more clearly. By the way, the process concern is dealt with in the next recommendation in so far as it says in getting input, the federalism impact statement, if you scroll to the left a little bit, also deals with who the agency contacted, the state, local, tribal government level. But that doesn't get at the whole concern that you raised, or that Seth surfaces, which is making sure that the right communication is there. I will say the bottom line is, I take Seth's point, which is there's just some difference, symbolically and otherwise, with respect to the government, nation to nation aspect that's going to be different in the state and local context. If for no other reason that, hey, it's a big friggin' tent, so far as state and local governments are concerned, right? Of how
I'd suggest that you and Seth and staff look at breaking out paragraph 10 into two separate paragraphs, one for tribal and one for state and local. And because each of you are looking at different problems, all right? Seth has a problem. You and Dan, you have a problem with who are they contacting? Is this a national organization, or is it the actual some individual states and localities? And those are different issues. And so I think they need to be separate out, but I don't think we should try to wordsmith it here. I think you guys should try to do that with the staff and come back next time. That's my suggestion.
So yeah, I think that I think there's thoughts about separating out state and local from the tribal, also separating out the official consultations from informal consultations. And then I think that's just a little clarity here in terms of the high level officials that we're referring to in terms of the recommendation are high level agency officials. Is that correct? We're not making recommendations about high level state government officials or local government officials or tribal officials. Is that right?
Well, you're exactly right. The language as stated there speaks about the agency officials.
Okay,
that's the reference to high level.
Yeah. Okay, that's what I make sure.
But I still think Bill's comments take us in the direction of trying to figure out, okay, on the other side, who they should be expected to consult with, and we may need to separate that out. Yeah.
Okay, so we might need to add that into it. Okay. Okay, so I think we have the marching orders with respect to recommendation 10. Let's try to get through the rest of these. I think we have time. Let's turn to recommendation 11. Okay, Jeff.
This goes back to that issue I raised earlier about the confidentiality. Where we removed that little C paragraph 11. I mean, that earlier recommendation sort of spoke about the confidentiality issue as sort of a given. Like it it's going to come up. But in number 11, I mean, we don't mention it. And so I'm just wondering if the summary should, and maybe this only applies to tribal, but whether the summary should include whether or not the state, local, and tribal officials ask for confidentiality on something. Because we already referred to it sort of as given earlier, but we haven't established it as an issue.
So would that be, in terms of establishing it as an issue, would it be established here in 11 and adding as a paragraph D, or would it be added earlier?
It's a good question. I mean, I think at a minimum, if we're going to cross-reference this recommendation, we should say something about it, but it may be better to say something about it earlier or maybe in the preamble.
Okay.
And I'm going to have to leave soon because I have to go to my law school and teach. But also in the last recommendation about FOIA, Congress should amend FOIA to protect information deemed sensitive by tribal governments. I don't know. Should that apply to state and local governments as well? Based on what Dan said a few minutes ago, maybe not. But I'm just going to raise that question before I leave.
Yeah.
Well, let me jump in on that, Jeff, because I know you have to go. I'm nervous about saying what I'm about to say is at state and local level, less about FOIA, but there may be some open records, laws relevant at the state level that I'd hate to have to go into in this report.
Yes.
But maybe out there. I hate to have to be asked to research them too, by the way, but that might be implicated.
The beauty of 50 states. Okay.
So
I don't know what to do about that, but yeah.
Maybe you could ignore that last comment then.
Yeah, exactly. Forget I said
it. Bill.
It was just to add to where it says proposed and I guess I don't know what it's A or B now, but what questions the agency asks such state, local, tribal officials to ascertain whether a proposed regulatory policy or action.
Okay, right.
Oh, and in the previous one, as to whether a given regulatory policy or action.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Any other comments on 11? So we have to think about the confidentiality question here. I think this will be the last recommendation we'll get to today. Any other comments on 11? All right, so our next meeting, and we'll have other times to make comments on these recommendations. Our next meeting will be April 21st from 9:30 to noon again. What we'll do is
any way to make it a little bit later.
I'm comfortable with making it a little bit later. I will leave that.
It's 6:30 in the morning
here. I understand that pain as a long-time West Coaster. Yes, we'll discuss with Bakaja whether there is flexibility in the schedule to move it a little bit later and report back as to when our next meeting will be, but it will be on April 21st. Right now, the schedule is 9:30 to noon, but we will provide you with updates if we're able to make changes to that. Thank you again, Dan and Seth, for your extraordinarily helpful contributions today, and to all the members of the committee and all the attendees to this meeting. I will look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. I don't know, Kaja, do you have any other comments? Sorry.
Oh, no, I don't. Thank you, though.
Okay, thanks, Kaja. Okay, take care, everyone.
Thank you.